I'd challenge anybody to look at the Spitfire and not to say it's the most beautiful aeroplane in the world. Just look at that elliptical wing. Just look at the way from the tip of the boss of the propeller to the trim tab on the tail. The whole aeroplane melds together beautifully. And then, of course, you've got the Merlin engine, that rumble, that music of the Merlin for the Battle of Britain, certainly, but also with the Griffon, which came along later. There's a thunderous engine. It just makes the most beautiful sound. So that makes the whole aeroplane iconic. But before we go and talk about the Battle of Britain and the prowess of the Spitfire in the Battle of Britain, and I should say right from the start, the Spitfire didn't win the Battle of Britain, but we may have lost it if we didn't have the Spitfire. But the design goes right the way back to the 1920s when Rolls-Royce were looking at doing new things with aero engines. Not big round aero engines, but inline to streamline. And a young man called R.J. Mitchell had put together a team at Southampton at Supermarine to design fast seaplanes to win the Snyder Trophy. Now that Snyder Trophy was absolutely vital to the development of aeroplanes in Britain. Not because any of the design features were taken into the Spitfire, or for that matter, the Hurricane or the Lancaster or any of the other aircraft that we developed in the Second World War, but rather because that is a technology demonstrator. It showed what could be done with things like liquid-cooled inline engines, so vital for the Spitfire. But R.J. Mitchell had his problems, of course. The first aircraft fighter he designed, the Type 224, was a complete disaster. And actually, it rather put him off doing it himself. Instead of that, he put together a team of about 150 people, including the great aerodynamicist Beverly Shenston. And here's one of the secrets of the Spitfire. That wing could well come from a PhD that Shenston wrote at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. So imagine that. The wing of the Spitfire could well have its lineage in a PhD study at the University of Heidelberg in 1929. There's only one photograph that links Shenston to it, but that photograph is conclusive. He's there with Lippisch and Predel, the two greatest aerodynamicists in Germany of the 1920s. I think there's a lot to show that it was Germany that helped us with that aeroplane. Not that the Germans actually understood what they'd done with the Spitfire. No, they didn't. However, it does give us an indication of how exciting aeroplane design was in the 1930s. By 1936, Mitchell had a design on the table that he was comfortable with getting his parent company, Vickers, to support to its first flight. The 5th of March, 1936, Mutt Summers, the chief test pilot of Vickers, took the Spitfire into the air for about 23 minutes from Eastleigh Airport, which is now Southampton Airport in Hampshire. This is very much a Hampshire aeroplane. Everybody who was involved in this aircraft moved down to Hampshire to work on it. And they may, like Al Faddy, who led one of the design teams, have come from Newcastle originally. But they were still at Southampton, at Woolston, at the works there, working on the Spitfire. Later, of course, they will be built at places like Castle Bromwich. Later, they would also be built in small factories around the south, in Salisbury, in Reading, in Newbury. But we're jumping ahead of the story. We need to look at that whole productionization of the Spitfire. One of the problems with the Spitfire is it takes an English craftsman to actually make that beautiful shape. This isn't like the Hurricane, which was a generation behind the Spitfire, easy for non-skilled people to put together. No, the Spitfire required riveters and engineers and people who understood the stresses of steel, because that doesn't have a carcass around which to hang those steel plates. Those steel plates, aluminium plates, I should say, and duralium, are actually created to take the stress of the aircraft. That's what makes it so exciting. It gives it 400 miles an hour, for example. As far as anyone can tell, the Spitfire had real problems right at the very beginning in that productionization. There's nobody left alive, alas, who can tell us about those days. But it took Supermarine, used to building beautifully crafted wooden flying boats, 2 years to work out how to put the Spitfire into production. And if it hadn't have been the Vickers company, which had bought Supermarine a decade before, we might not have had the Spitfire. In fact, in 1936, the Air Ministry thought perhaps they'd only need 310 Spitfires, and then we'd move on to a twin-engine fighter, because, of course, it was about shooting down bombers. When it comes to air combat, there's always that myth that the Spitfire would engage the fighters and the Hurricanes the bombers, as if it was some choice. The truth is, there was no choice about it. The Spitfire could outclimb the Hurricane. So the Spitfire, in that 10 minutes of combat climb at 100% power, at full boost, would actually get to 15,000 feet. And the poor old Hurricane, not quite as streamlined as the Spitfire, would get to 10 or 12,000 feet. That's where the bombers are. But the fighters were up at 15 or higher. And that was a real key to the success of the Spitfire. It was able to keep the German fighters, the Bf-109, the Bf-110s, away from the Hurricanes, who were doing a brilliant job in destroying bombers. The gun arrangement of the Hurricane, with the 4 guns, the Browning machine guns grouped on each wing close together, is a much better and heavier firepower than the Spitfire, with its 4 Browning machine guns spread across the wing. It wasn't until the cannon came along that the Spitfire was able to match the Bf-109, for example, in direct firepower. But it didn't actually need that direct firepower, because one of the things that the Spitfire had was the ability at high level to turn. Now, if you look at the statistics, the Hurricane at low and medium altitude could outturn a Spitfire. But once you get to the combat up in the 15, 20, 25, sometimes 30,000 feet, that's where the elliptical wing comes in. And that elliptical wing is part of the story. Beverly Shenston designed a wing that's not only flexible and works, it works like this. It doesn't quite flap, but it seems as if it does. When you're flying the Spitfire and you look out at the wing, it seems to move. And that's because it's got flexibility in, and that's because it's got strength in it. Old El Fadi, we were talking about earlier, was able to create a system of using telescopic spar structures to taper out to the end of the wing to give it rigidity all the way out to the tip. And we know, of course, after the Battle of Britain, that the Spitfire had the wingtips taken off in order to increase the roll rate at low level against the Focke-Wulf 190. But again, we're getting ahead of the story. The key to the success of the Spitfire in the Battle of Britain could well be Dowding in husbanding his Spitfires in Britain while sending over 400 Hurricanes to the Battle of France. The French had no integrated air defense system. They had nothing like the Dowding system we had in Britain. They didn't have the observer corps. They didn't have radar. They didn't have ground-controlled interception. They relied on the pilots flying around looking for the Germans. And the real issue you've got when it's flying around looking at the Germans is quite simply that you're going to be low on fuel, probably, the law of averages says this, at the time you want to be absolutely ready for combat. So the great thing about the Battle of Britain, from my perspective, is that we had sufficient Spitfires, about 19 squadrons worth, about 38, 39 Hurricane squadrons worth. That worked really well. It gave people like Park in number 11 group defending London and the south of England options. But when it comes to looking at the Spitfire in terms of what it did in the Battle of Britain, we have to remember the mystique that had been built up around it from May 1940, when Lord Beaver became Minister of Aircraft Production. What I like about Maxwell Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, is that he was a man who could see the main message. And that main message was very simple. He needed an icon for the people of Britain to get behind. Various reasons, including a Jamaican newspaper called the Daily Gleaner, which asked him how much a bomber would cost, could people buy one? He decided it actually would be quite a good idea for people to buy Spitfires. So let's look at that aeroplane there. It doesn't have a name on, but there are 1,500 Spitfires that were named for people or places or companies, whether it was the Marksman for Marks and Spencer, or whether it was the Clan for the Clan shipping line, whether it was Sarum and South Wilts for the people around Salisbury. 1,500 of those, costing £5,000 each, were bought by ordinary people. I was going to say people like you and me, but actually those people are like that generation of grandparents who were in the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain wasn't just about fighters, remember. It was about the whole nation. It's the one time the whole nation pulled together, whether you're a GPO linesman restringing the telephone line between here at Uxbridge and the bunker and headquarters up at Stanmore, or whether you're the baker who's providing bread for those sandwiches at the NAFI, and by the way, they produced a Spitfire called Counterattack for the Royal Air Force. So it's, whether or not it's the NAFI baker who's got the bread, everybody was working on the same side, which is quite remarkable. The other thing we have to remember about the Battle of Britain is that wonderful way in which the Morris car factory at Cowley, and you would have driven past if you've been there, the BMW factory. Well, that BMW Mini Factory there was actually number one civilian repair unit. The road you drive on was the north-south runway. There's a flyover, it goes over what was the east-west runway. So every night, a big trailer called a Queen Mary trailer, built in Andover by a small company that was making steamrollers just 6 months before the Battle of Britain. They were able to take those trailers to air stations. So in fighter command, when you had lost an aeroplane in air combat, it could be replaced. There were production factories. But if you'd had one damaged, you didn't repair it on the airfield. You put it on this Queen Mary trailer, and overnight it was taken to Cowley, to the Civil Repair Unit, or perhaps, if it was badly damaged, to AST at Handball or Supermarine at Eastleigh, and they were repaired. A civilian workforce that had worked in the car industry, so were skilled with metal, and they were skilled with tools. They set about putting those aircraft back together. If you talk to people like Tom Neal, who was a Battle of Britain ace, flew a 249 squadron, flew Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain from Boscombe Down and then from North Weald, he will tell you that they had 12 aircraft online, they had 18 pilots, and then after a day's combat, they might only have 8 aircraft that were airworthy. They'd go to bed. The next morning, there were another 4 there. There were 12 aircraft again. And this is the remarkable piece about the civilian repair unit. One of the issues, though, for people like me who champion the Spitfire, is the Spitfire took a lot longer to build. It took 3 days longer to build than a Hurricane, which meant you couldn't have as many as you would have wanted. It also took about 5 days longer to mend than a Hurricane. If you look at the Hurricane, that back fuselage, it's stretched canvas, it's Irish linen, doped and stretched into place. But if you look at the Spitfire behind, that is beautifully worked duralumin. That's a subtle and important difference with the aircraft. One of the key factors for those of us who champion the Spitfire, not as the victor of the Battle of Britain, but certainly as a major contributor to the morale battle, is the simple fact that every German fighter pilot shot down and interrogated, and you can read their interrogations, they all say, oh yeah, I was shot down by a Spitfire. Even when it was absolutely definite it was a Hurricane. There was Spitfire envy, there was an elitism about the Spitfire. If you read newspapers of the time, it talks about Spitfires. There's a Spitfire fund. There's no Hurricane fund. It's all about naming aeroplanes. Yes, certainly a number of Hurricanes were named, but they were not bought. They were not bought, for example, like the 24 that were bought by neutral Uruguay, or the 23 from Argentina, or the 17 or 18 called Dorothy. There was an amazing lady, the wife of a Royal Air Force squadron leader, who put an advert into every newspaper in the British Commonwealth and Empire. And she said, if your name's Dorothy, send me a donation. 10 shillings is enough. Mind you, 10 shillings is quite a lot in 1940. And I will ensure we put it together in a fund and we'll buy a Spitfire. They ended up buying 17. So the naming of Spitfires is an important part of the whole Spitfire mystique. Now, when it comes to discussing which was the best fighter of the Battle of Britain, the lines are drawn, the advocates are on all sides. There are those who believe it was the Messerschmitt because it had more powerful guns, the cannon in the nose, for example. There are those who believe it was the Hurricane and who claim the statistics of more aircraft. About 52% of aircraft shot down in the Battle of Britain were shot down by Hurricanes, compared to anti-aircraft guns and barrage balloons and Spitfires and Blenheims and Defiants and Navy Gladiators or Fulmars or any of the other aircraft. That is, of course, because there were more Hurricanes. And those of us who think that without the Spitfire, the Battle of Britain wouldn't have been won, not to say that it won it, it's a key factor. And it's a key factor because of the morale boost it gave to everybody, and it's a key factor because it was good at dogfights, fighter on fighter. But at the end of the day, the real issue with flying these aeroplanes is who's in that cockpit. Was it 18-year-old Geoffrey Wellen, whose first scramble, he gets airborne with his wingman, Brian Kinkham. They come through the cloud over Beachy Head, and the controller says, your targets should be in front of you now. There are about 130, and there were just 2 of them. Imagine being 18 years old and finding that you were suddenly faced with odds of more than 100 to 1. This is not what you would call your best day. But he survived. Dear Geoffrey survived all the way through the war until just a few years ago. We know a lot from people like Geoffrey Wellen because of his autobiography, First Light, but we know also a lot because we've saved the records. We're very lucky to have places like the bunker here at Uxbridge that can tell us those stories. They'll tell us about the training of the pilots. And they came from all sorts of interesting places. Spitfires were flown by Brits, by Poles, by New Zealanders, by Canadians, by Czechoslovaks, by people from Jamaica, by people from Barbados, by people from Southern Rhodesia or South Africa. And they all pulled together and flew as one, as RAF Fighter Command. And Spitfire and Hurricane pilots might swap between squadrons and between types. And many of them had their own favorites. Dennis David, known as Mr. Hurricane, rather than change to a Spitfire squadron, stayed with Hurricanes because he loved the Hurricane. He said every time he was hit and badly damaged, it took him home. And there'll be others who will look at the Spitfire and say, yes, but it's the Spitfire. I just felt, like Geoffrey Wellen would say, I didn't climb into it, I put it on. Now I can tell you as somebody who's flown the Spitfire, he's absolutely right. In the air, you think the Spitfire into a turn. You think it into a maneuver. But perhaps I could just end with a quote from the lovely Joy Lofthouse, an air transport auxiliary female pilot who delivered Spitfires from 1942 onwards. Joy delivered over 400 Spitfires. I remember distinctly having lunch with her, talking about Spitfires, and she said, the Spitfire, whether it was a Merlin engine or a Griffin engine, was a delight to fly. In the air, it was beautiful. But on the ground, it was a right bitch. And there you have it from somebody who delivered 404 Spitfires in her time. I find that conclusive to me that the Spitfire in the air is the thoroughbred. It's the most beautiful aeroplane. But like a lot of tail drags and a lot of aircraft with narrow undercarriage tracks, it is not the aircraft for a beginner.